Hi folks, I'm Wes Kell. Welcome to the program. In today's discussion, we're going to talk about the primacy of the customer-supplier relationship. We believe that there are many roles that are assumed during the course of our work careers, whether we're leaders or observers or stewards. And the role that we perform within inside the customer-supplier relationship is perhaps the most important role that we assume. Unfortunately, during the course of day-to-day activity, we may lose sight of the fact that this customer-supplier relationship exists. And even if we don't lose sight of that, we may forget that it is the most important role amongst all the roles that we could manifest. And that can lead to bad outcomes for us as an individual and for our organization. This ability to lose sight of the customer-supplier relationship is particularly true in two cases. First being IT and internal organizations that can sometimes forget that they were created in order to support customers within inside the enterprise. And the other case is those organizations that have a measure of protection from the larger economic realities around them. But in the end, that measure of protection is a buffer. It is not a wall. And in time, if economic conditions are sufficiently hard, they will be reminded of the customer-supplier relationship, and the units within inside those organizations that are suppliers, if they've not been behaving as suppliers supporting customers, will be rudely reminded of that fact. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, we've got a bunch of topics to go through. First of all, we're going to have a brief overview. Then we're going to talk about what is this customer-supplier relationship. Then we'll step back and look at the market. The market is an underlying assumption of the customer-supplier relationship that we need to have a little grounding in what it is and what its assumptions are in order to fully appreciate how the customer-supplier relationship works. Then we'll move on to talk about customers and suppliers and some of the attributes of those. Next, we'll talk about resource allocation decisions and variations upon the market, how resources are allocated. It's very important for looking at how different structures for different organizations affect behaviors. Next, we'll talk about norms that are associated with the customer-supplier relationship. As we'll argue, the role we perform has certain behaviors and practices that are appropriate to it, and that leads to values that actually shape our identity and have tremendous implications for our work performance as well as our careers. Then we're going to turn our attention to focus upon the role of the internal supplier within inside the customer-supplier relationship. And as we close, we're going to look at those forces which tend to cause us to forget that the customer-supplier relationship exists, and that's the most important role that we perform. And then we'll look at some ways which we can be reminded of its importance and see things clearly on a going forward basis. Okay, so way of overview. The customer-supplier relationship has very humble beginnings. It fundamentally deals with how resource allocation decisions are made. Well, that sounds all very dry, but the fact of the matter is, as we'll drill down on this, we'll find out there's some very deep implications associated with it. In short, the roles that we assume shape our principles, our behaviors, our practices. They basically fashion our identity. And we need to be mindful of that, because that bleeds into larger issues dealing with ownership, and accountability, and leadership. All things very important to our success as individuals inside organizations and in our lives. So what is a customer-supplier relationship? Well, basically it refers to the interaction amongst players in the allocation of resources using a market-based mechanism. There are many different ways to allocate resources, and we'll talk about a couple of those. But the market-based mechanism is the one that shapes the customer-supplier relationship. And we're not going to look so much at the decision-making that takes place in resource allocation. What we're more concerned with are the roles that people perform in those resource allocation exchanges. And the reason why is, as we said earlier, is because it affects our personal roles, our behaviors, and the expectations we have of each other as we engage in these exchanges. But more fundamentally, it defines what is appropriate conduct for a customer or a supplier as they engage in these resource allocation decisions. And that's something we as suppliers of services and products to others need to understand, otherwise we can behave inappropriately and achieve suboptimal outcomes. But let's take a moment and step back and talk about the market. What is a market? A market is simply a gathering of people for the purpose of buying and selling a thing, typically goods and services. A market consists of the following elements. First of all, you have customers. Customers are the folks who want goods and services. We'll identify them by these little orange balls on the right-hand side. Secondly, it consists of suppliers. Suppliers are those people who provide goods and services. We'll identify them with these little blue balls on the left-hand side. Third, you have resources. These are items of value that are used in the exchange. For example, one resource is the goods and services provided by the supplier to the customer. The other resource is the payment, the money typically, that the customer provides the supplier in exchange for the goods and services. And lastly, we have the market, which is the forum for the exchange of those goods and services. And what essentially takes place is that a customer provides money to a supplier through the market, and that supplier, through the market, provides the customer the goods and services they are looking for. In this graphic, a very simple dynamic, but within inside that cloud that is a market, a very complex set of forces at work. Now let's talk about some assumptions of the market. First of all, looking at this graphic we just drew, you'll notice how we've labeled it the standard market mechanism. What we mean by that is that there are multiple suppliers and multiple customers who are connected through the market, and they're all competing for goods and services and money. And this is what we call the standard market. We're going to show some variations on that later on. Another expression for this is the fragmented market. No particular constituency, no one supplier, no one customer controls the market, hence it's fragmented. One of the assumptions in the market is that all the players, whether a supplier or customer, act out of self-interest. A second assumption is that all players are free to associate. A customer does not have to buy from supplier X. A supplier does not have to provide services to customer Y. Next, this exchange relationship is mutually beneficial. Both suppliers and customers benefit from doing business together. Now, we say mutually beneficial. That's not the same as equally beneficial. In fact, in general, customers are supposed to derive more benefit from market-based transactions than suppliers. Now, why would a customer buy a good and service? Because he intends to get something out of that good and service which is worth more than the money he paid for it, right? That stands to reason. Next, prices determine what goods and services will be supplied and which customers will be able to obtain those goods and services. So based upon the laws of supply and demand, which is beyond the scope of our discussion here, a price will be set for various goods and services, and if you have the money, you get it. So the determination is made by price and availability of funds. But prices are influenced by both the information and the relative power of the different players within inside the market. I don't think it's surprising to anyone that Walmart has tremendous power over the prices they pay from their suppliers for various products that they buy compared to smaller chains. Now, these are just some of the market assumptions, the big ones I'm concerned with here. There are other assumptions dealing with unlimited wants and a bunch of other things that are beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here. But you need to understand these assumptions as the material to what follows. Let's talk about customers a little bit. The distinction between a customer and a supplier is fundamental to the market-based model. The customer is that entity which derives value from procuring a good or service from a supplier. As we said earlier, this is supposed to be a mutually beneficial exchange, but it's typically unequal if the customer derives more value. For example, when you go and buy food, okay, you pay X dollars for that food. Well, the value of that food to you is that you stay alive. That is certainly a much larger value than whatever money you paid for that food. You and the supplier are both benefiting, but you're certainly benefiting far more than he is. Now, a customer has 5 main attributes. The first one is that customers determine what needs they're going to satisfy and what particular goods and services they're going to purchase to satisfy those needs. This isn't communism. You're not going to be told what your needs are and what you're going to consume in order to meet those needs. You have free choice. The next attribute is that customers get to choose which suppliers they will do business with. Third, the customer is supposed to have or able to secure the resources necessary to pay for the goods and services. We talk about securing resources, essentially talking about credit. The fourth attribute is that the customer is accountable for the end value of the goods and services that they purchase. What I'm speaking to here is more tuned to internal discussions. For example, if marketing hires an advertising organization to develop an advertising campaign and pays them X millions of dollars for it, marketing is accountable for the ultimate success of that advertising campaign. Because basically they told the advertisers what they wanted, the advertisers provided it to them, but if marketing asked for the wrong thing, well, that's really marketing's problem. And finally, customers are supposed to have the authority to issue work commitments and to be able to honor those commitments. What this means is that they shouldn't exceed the signature authority when they're engaging other organizations, particularly suppliers. Now let's talk a moment about suppliers. The supplier is the entity who is willing to provide the goods and services to the customer in exchange for something else of value. And the supplier has attributes as well. There are 4 main attributes. The first one is that the supplier takes risks, makes initial investments in order to create the goods and services, the products that the customer is going to buy. The second one is that suppliers typically use analysis to determine what customer needs they're going to attempt to meet and what goods and services they'll create to meet those needs. and how those goods and services will be created. They're responsible for essentially understanding the behavior of their customers and giving them that which they want. Third, suppliers compete with other suppliers on price, service, quality, and other attributes of the goods and services that they provide. And finally, the supplier is accountable to the customer for delivering the goods and services to the customer. Just as the customer is responsible for the ultimate value of those goods and services, the supplier is responsible for actually delivering the goods and services in the first place. So how does this work with inside resource allocation decisions? As we said, the market is one method for allocating resources among interested parties. There are other mechanisms, including central planning, voting, and force. Now, many folks may think that central planning is actually the primary means for making resource allocation decisions in large organizations, when in fact the opposite is true. In small organizations, central planning may work. We have less than 100, 200 people. The senior execs can basically keep their thumb on the pulse of everything that's going on and work together to achieve common goals. But as the organization size grows, the importance of leadership inside each one of the units becomes far more important to the group's ultimate success, and they have to have a means of coordinating themselves, and that is where a market-based mechanism comes in. And so while we may have the veneer of central planning, the fact of the matter is that the underlying resource allocation is taking place in a market-based format. But that sounds nice in theory, but how does that work? Well, let's look at a couple of examples. First of all, let's look at a market variation, which we call a supplier concentration. And what we see here is that we have multiple customers that are trying to get something from a single supplier. And this is typical of the dynamic that takes place within inside large organizations where you have many constituencies trying to get something out of central IT, or trying to get something out of HR, or trying to get something out of facility, or out of finance. They all feel they have multiple customers and they're the only supplier because there's only one IT organization, there's only one finance organization. And folks may feel that, hey, I've cornered the market. But in fact, you haven't, because you have to make decisions on how you're going to allocate resources amongst these different customers to keep them happy, or at least keep them all reasonably unhappy. And the second market variation is what they call a customer concentration, where you have a single customer and multiple suppliers competing for attention of that customer. And here we reverse the roles, and this is how internal IT can behave relative towards external vendors who are trying to provide them services. As we mentioned earlier with the standard model where we had multiple suppliers and multiple customers, here we're looking at two flavors of the opposite extreme where you only have one supplier or one customer, but multiples of the other party. Now, understandably, given these concentrations, certain behaviors of the market model we talked about earlier will be impacted. Earlier we mentioned that people in organizations act in their own self-interest. Well, when you begin to have market concentrations, you start to have more focus upon the collective interest in how decisions are made. The degree of free association is constrained, as is really only one customer or only one supplier. And finally, the influence of pricing and how resources are allocated is diminished by the growing importance of influence within inside decision-making and the power of the respective participants in the discussion. I point these out to recognize the fact that these particular aspects of the standard market model are influenced by these market variations, but they're muted. So free association is muted within inside these variations, but it's not eliminated. If we would eliminate self-interest, we would eliminate free association, eliminate the importance of pricing within inside decision-making, then we would have true central planning. But we don't. These attributes are just diminished in importance, which means we still have to make decisions on how we're going to allocate resources amongst various parties. And that means we're going to have a decision-making framework, a mechanism for making those resource allocations. And that still remains in the market.